word nerd, wordsmith, wordy, wordless. Oxford Dictionary says a word is a single, distinct, meaningful element of speech or writing, used with others or sometimes alone. We say each one matters. No extra words is literature, minimalist style. And we're getting you right to the story.
Family Planning by Tina Taco. After my grandfather finished with her that first time, my grandmother sat in a boiling bath, which cost extra then, at the Century Hotel. 15 silver pails were brought up by a young Negro girl, pretty, a mulatto maybe, with a tip-down head and big eyes the one time she showed them. Another girl, this one all dark as the maids' uniforms that were just silly on them, stripped the sheets down to the mattress, her brown bun pointed at the smoke from my grandfather's Havana. The mulatto dumped the pails between my grandmother's legs. After the 7th, the 8th, she said, "You sure, missus?" But my grandmother cracked her neck past the bass porcelain rim, trying to put herself in her mother's arms, trying to remember how her mother had kept from having Uncle John for so long, trying to remember if it was salt that drew it out or not. So the mulatto made 7 more trips to the stove, at a penny a pail. Only the last pail made my grandfather rattle some change. Only the last pail made my grandmother speak. "My husband," she said, her first time. "My husband, he won't tip you." Only the last pail, salted, shocked my grandmother's head from the porcelain rim into the eyes of the pretty mulatto. Choose by Mary O'Keefe Brady. A for anxious, B for bewildered, C for complicated. Roe versus Wade. Row, wade, or dive into the deep end. I've waded in too deep. My feet barely touch the bottom. I float down the river, can't get my bearing. Bare my soul, can't bear my soul. Choice. Row, row, row your boat. Latch on, catch the ripple, ride the wave. No, wade, ride the wade. Choice, word choice. Wade in deeper, float, tread water, churn water, baby floating in water. Water of life, bread of life, life, whose life? Mine or yours? D for decide, E for elect, F for fingerprint. Yours or mine? Choose.
Hello there. Welcome to No Extra Words, One Person's Search for Story. My name is Chris Baker-Dersch. I'm your producer and editor. There's a lot going on today. This is our last episode in our traditional flash fiction format because we're undergoing a change. I'm not going to go into all of that today. I hope you'll tune in next week for episode 100, where we're going to celebrate and party and talk about the past and the future, and we're going to do all of that next week, because today I really want to focus on this topic. This topic is so important, I don't want it to get overridden by all that other stuff going on. So I just wanted to say that up front. Today we are talking about choice, as in women's reproductive choices. And I put out the call months ago for women writers to talk about that issue in their own way, in their own artistic style, and they have responded, and that is what we are sharing today. On January 22nd, 1973, that's 45 years ago this week, the Supreme Court of the United States handed down the Roe versus Wade decision codifying into law a woman's right to choose in the United States. I'm going to read from Roe in a little bit because I think it's important to go back to the source, but before I do that, I want to tell you a little bit about me and my story and what made me want to do this episode this way. First of all, if you're listening and you're an anti-abortion person, probably if you're an anti-abortion person, you've stopped listening by now. But if you're still there, I hope you'll stay with us. I hope you'll listen, because you're presence here is welcome and your opinions are welcome. We're not trying to be black and white on any issue. That's never been the goal and purpose of this show. What I really wanted to do is think about, in the form of literature, the nuances, the complications, the messy places around this issue. And I'm going to tell you my own story just because I think it illustrates how messy this issue can really be. So I grew up, first of all, I'm 40 years old this year. So this decision has been in effect my entire life. So I did not have to live life before Roe, which is something that I didn't really realize what a privilege that is until later in my life. But it's true. I grew up as a pretty religious person, and when I thought about abortion as a child, I was pretty against it, just because it seemed like a lot of the people around me were against it. I want to point out that doesn't mean my parents. I never heard my parents discuss this issue. I don't know how they feel about this issue, but I did not get a lot of values around conservatism and things like that from my parents, but I did with people that I was surrounded by. I can remember in college being upset because I felt like popular culture just assumed that all women were pro-choice, and I felt left out of that conversation. My own beliefs around this issue started to be shaped actually much later, in my mid-20s, and I'm going to tell you about the year where everything changed for me. It's not a dramatic story, it's just my story. In 2004, I was 25 years old. I entered a local writing contest, and I submitted a children's book manuscript. It was called Red Boots, and won, I think, second prize in my category. So my piece, along with the other pieces that had won prizes, were published in a little booklet form and distributed through the local library, and there was an event where we all got to read our pieces. It was really fun to be acknowledged in that way. The grand prize winner won in her category, which was memoir, and over the whole competition. And her piece was called Red-Blooded Woman, and mine was called Red Boots. And because they were so close together in title, we always ended up back to back with one another, even though the content of our pieces was so dramatically different, because mine was a cute little children's book story about a girl who really wants to wear red boots, and hers was a memoir piece about her traveling to Mexico in the 1960s to procure an abortion. And I was still at a point in my life where I didn't think that I was a huge fan of abortion, but I felt like I couldn't say that. But listening to her story was very powerful and very profound, and one of the things that several people pointed out was the similarities between her piece and my piece, even though they were so dramatically different. The similarities between the little girl who wants to assert her independence and the woman who just needs this medical procedure. And that caused me to think, because up until that time, I had never really considered what life was like before Roe. And to put myself in the shoes of that woman started to change me a little bit. I was talking about this a month or two later with a woman I worked with at the time. And this was a woman who was older. She was in her retirement job. And she was a Lutheran minister's wife and also a Lutheran minister's daughter. So we had the religious background in common. I mentioned to her, I said, I didn't know the context of this story that had been written, and it was really interesting to hear about women's experiences before Roe, and that's when she told me hers. This woman, the way she told it to me, I can only repeat what she said, she had a best friend in the 1960s who became pregnant by her then fiance. She was teaching at the time, and if she had gone forward with the pregnancy, she would have been fired. And her fiance was still in school at the time, and there wouldn't have been enough money for them. So terminating the pregnancy was in large part a matter of livelihood for this woman. And she had to go to London to do it. And even though her fiance really, really wanted to go with her, he couldn't because he was still in school, and there was also the issue of the money. So my friend's father, the Lutheran minister, took a seat on the plane next to her and flew with her to London, so she would not have to fly there and back by herself to obtain this procedure. And hearing that story really shook me to my core, because there were so many things at play there about how this really does change women's lives and how tough these decisions really are, and how much privilege we have now in, if this is something for whatever reason you need to do, you can go to a clinic in your town, hopefully, if you still have that right in your state. There are some states where it's harder than others, and I respect that as well. And that really started to change my opinion on abortion. I've never had one myself, and so I can only speak other people's words when it comes to abortion. But in the years since then, I have held space for people who I have known who have had them, and I have realized that my role in that situation is to listen. And what I have learned by listening is that it's not simple. Maybe for some people it is, but I have never met anyone for whom it is simple. It's a decision, it's a privilege, it's a right, but that doesn't make it easy. And I think the problem that we run into with an issue as divisive as this is we don't give space for people to talk about how it isn't easy. Because if a woman admits that this is a tough decision and that she's having a hard time with it and that she's wrestling with it, it fuels the fire of all the people who want to tell her the 900 reasons why she shouldn't do it. We don't really have room in this culture for things to be hard and still okay at the same time. And so we don't hear those narratives except in our private places and in our conversations where we are completely safe to talk about it. And I have said that to my husband many times. Why don't we hear the nuance? Why don't we hear about the messiness? On both sides, because I've also heard that from people who are very, 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 very against it, but then have come up against it for reasons they didn't anticipate. And they also can't talk about it because it means letting go of their very dearly held absolutist position. We don't have room for anything in this debate that's not absolutist, and that makes it very hard. And I was complaining to my husband about this, and one day I realized I have a microphone. And that was the story I wanted to tell about how abortion can simultaneously be something that should absolutely be allowed in a free society and still something that is hard. It doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be both. And our conversation about it can be so much deeper than it has been. I read somewhere that about a third of Americans, when you really dig down into their feelings on this issue, they really don't fall into the camps of pro-life and pro-choice where they get placed. They really fall somewhere in the middle, wrestling with the nuance. And I'm going to read the court's decision, pieces of it, in a few minutes, and I think you'll see the court also wrestling with it. And so I wanted to do an episode on choice and probably offend everyone in the process, because that's something that's just inevitable when you talk about this issue. But I was so pleased to hear from the women that I heard from, and their submissions spoke exactly to what I was talking about. Tina Taco got us off to the perfect start with that whole experience of life before Roe and what pregnancy termination really used to look like, and all of the emotions and technical stuff associated with that. And then Mary O'Keefe Brady's poem just hit the nail on the head with how hard this is, how hard this issue can really be when you're thinking about all of the things that you're thinking about all at the same time. It was beautiful. It was my privilege and my honor to share it. And the other thing I wanted to talk about in this episode is the fact that choice is so much bigger than abortion. Women face so much pressure over the course of their lives around their reproductive choices. I don't know of a woman who hasn't run into some kind of pressure around, are you going to have children? Are you going to have more children? Are you going to try for children? Are you going to use this form of birth control or this medical procedure? You know, infertility treatments and medical treatments. And it just seems like the whole world really wants to talk about what a woman is or is not doing with her uterus. And many times throughout history, this conversation is had by men. There's a movie, A Private Matter. It was a made-for-TV movie. You can get it on YouTube. And it was based on the story of a woman who was a TV personality in the 1960s who sought an abortion because there was going to be abnormalities with her baby. And became a huge issue, a huge media issue. But one of the things you see in the movie is the conversation about whether or not she should be allowed to do this. And the conversation is between her husband, the doctor, and the medical board. She's not in it really at all. She's sitting in the room while they talk about her, but this is not her conversation. And I remember even hearing, so my mother had an ovarian cyst while she was pregnant in 1976, not with me, with my sister, and very nearly lost my sister in that process. And I had heard that story many, many times, and the last time my dad told me that story, he was talking about his conversation with the doctor around what they should do. He was talking to the doctor around what they should do with this situation involving my mom. And I just wanted to shake him and say, but where was she? This is her body. This is her pregnancy. And it just feels like this conversation that men have between men about women's bodies. And there's such a long history of that. There's such a long history of lack of control, of the conversation just being around what men want to do to women's bodies. It's infuriating. And so when I talk about choice, I wanted to bring that whole conversation. So the second half of this episode, which is coming up next, is about those things, all of the choices that women make, and the ability to have a choice. Linda Bonney's poem, Single Sexless Mother, is really about the ability to say no, which we think of as a fundamental right, but it is actually really new. The idea that you have a legal right to say no is really new. Something I looked up that just made me rage. Marital rape as a term did not exist in this country until 1979. Laws did not start being passed against it until 1979, after a man had been acquitted of raping his wife. The idea that you have a right to say no to your partner is a concept that has been created in America in my lifetime, and did not become illegal in every state until 1993. The idea that you have a right to say no to sex with the person you are married to is a very, very new concept, and that is infuriating. I'm getting passionate, so I'm going to talk a little bit about our close. We're going to close with Rebecca Nemeth, and she has a piece that is one of those moments where when I heard it, I said out loud, I thought I was the only one. I thought I was the only one who had ever had this kind of thing happen. And it is about how a woman's right to control her fertility has been dictated by outside forces since the invention of the first forms of birth control. And the ability to have a choice around abortion is part of the ability to have a choice around birth control, is part of the ability to have a choice around sex, is part of the ability to have a choice around health. All of those things are related. You can think of them as different, and they are, but they're related. So that's my passionate story about why I wanted to put this together. I'm going to get you to all of that. I've changed my mind from what I said earlier. We're going to go to those pieces by Linda Bonney and Rebecca Nemeth now, and then stick around to the very end because we are going to close with a reading of some excerpts from Roe, and I will tell you the story of how that decision was made by 9 men, not a single woman, deciding the future of women's reproductive health in the United States. I hope that this episode will give you something to think about. That's all one can really hope for in this life. And we will talk about so many more things, and I will see you to have a big celebration and to launch our future next week, just 7 days away, here on No Extra Words. Thank you so much for listening. Single Sexless Mother by Linda Bonney. As a single sexless mother, my thoughts have changed. First, let's get this straight. I am woman, not girl. Your sleazy, crude, look at my tits comments do nothing for me. Nothing. As a single sexless mother, my approaches have changed. Decent conversation is sexy, respectful gestures appreciated, and holding space devoured. As a single sexless mother, my attitudes have changed. My time for you is split, compromised, yet incredibly high on my to-do list, with toothpaste in my hair. As a single sexless mother, my views have changed. I'm not ready to get married again yesterday, even shave my legs regularly, and fumble like a teen between the sheets. As a single sexless mother, I'm surprised by the change. Sex is a foreign concept, orgasmic tingles in the simplicity of seeing two people pash. As a single sexless mother, my values have changed. I admire intellect, creativity, passion, all of which can be found in the bedroom, I suppose. As a single sexless mother, my body has changed. I am voluptuous, curvy, belly-scarred, and want to honor my yoni. As a single sexless mother, what has really changed? True sex was absent even when I was unhappily married. I'm rocking it now as a single sexless mother, with sexless power. I am true to myself now more than I have ever been. Single, sexless mother.
This piece was originally written for my Photo in 100 Words project. It was inspired by an abstract photo I took that looked, to me, like a pregnant belly. My boyfriend thought it looked more like a whale. Anyway, this is the true story that plagued my mind until it flowed out of my pen. It's been edited for Chris's podcast. A whale of a choice. My throat was swelling up, closing in, making it harder to breathe. The night before my OB/GYN appointment, I was frantically researching every birth control method I could find. After 15 years on the pill, I'd just learned that, according to my body, I should have popped out 20 children by now. Did you know that hormonal birth control actually tricks your body into thinking you're pregnant? I didn't. Not until the night before my date with the cold metal horizontal horsey. The weight gain and the nausea suddenly made sense. For 15 years, my chubby little ass thought I was pregnant. Or my chubby little uterus, more accurately. I felt like I'd been impregnated with pills. Like a twisted kind of statutory rape. There are so many choices, one article claimed, and went on about several different methods of dosing myself with the same hormones in the pill I was trying to ditch. Don't want hormones? No problem. Your doctor can stick a copper T-shaped tampon up your hoo-ha, and it'll poison every sperm that swims by for the next 5 years. Just give me a syringe and rat poison. I'll save them the trouble. No? What about these permanent, quote-unquote, non-surgical inserts that plug fallopian tubes with metal coils? They create scar tissue roadblocks for eggs. And other painful complications that have led to hysterectomies. Surgery? No thanks. So I'm left with condoms and the rhythm method, both of which have laughable statistics. The word choice suggests some degree of control, but instead, I was spiraling out of it. I didn't see the pregnant belly in my photo until I was editing it in Lightroom, and I didn't see the whale until Nick pointed it out. Choice, I thought, and vividly relived that night. P.S. Since I wrote this story, I've come across some information that suggests the rhythm method is actually just as effective as the pill if done properly. I was floored and very angry, once again, that this knowledge is just not taught in our pill-popping culture. I just wanted you to know that you always have a choice. It's just, some choices are harder than others, and you may have to dig deeper for the answers that will work for you. When I went to the doctor the next day, my OB/GYN, predictably, upped the hormone dose in my pills. I filled the prescription for a couple of months, just in case I changed my mind, but I never took another birth control pill again. I'm currently in the process of ditching the condoms. So, I split my time between learning more about natural birth control and trying to convince my boyfriend to get surgery so I don't have to. Hey, it doesn't always have to be all my choice.
What follows is an excerpt from the Supreme Court majority decision in Roe v. Wade. This case was decided January 22nd, 1973. The way the Supreme Court works is a justice may agree with the majority opinion, in which case they sign on to this document. They can agree with the decision of the majority, but for different reasons, in which case they write their own document, which means a concurring opinion, or they can disagree, which is a dissenting opinion. So this particular document was written by Justice Harry Blackmun for the majority. It was signed on by Chief Justice William Berger, by Judge William Douglas, by Judge William J. Brennan Jr., by Judge Potter Stewart, by Judge Thurgood Marshall, and by Judge Lewis F. Powell Jr. Of those, Warren Berger and Justices Douglas and Stewart filed concurring opinions, which means they wrote their own document. Justice Byron White filed a dissenting opinion, which was joined by Judge William Rehnquist. William Rehnquist also filed a dissenting opinion. So that is how the decision of the court shook out. It was 7-2. As you're listening to those names, as I noted before, there are no women involved in this judgment at all. The first woman to sit on the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor, would not be seated until 1981. What follows is some excerpts, and as I said, I will link the full decision so you can read it in the show notes if you're interested. So this is Judge Blackmun writing. We forthwith acknowledge our awareness of the sensitive and emotional nature of the abortion controversy, of the vigorous opposing views, even among physicians, and of the deep and seemingly absolute convictions that the subject inspires. One's philosophy, one's experiences, one's exposure to the raw edges of human existence, one's religious training, one's attitudes towards life and family and their values, and the moral standards one establishes and seeks to observe are all likely to influence and to color one's thinking and conclusions about abortion. The principal thrust of appellant's attack on the Texas statutes is that they improperly invade a right said to be possessed by the pregnant woman to choose to terminate her pregnancy. Appellant would discover this right in the concept of personal liberty embodied in the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause, or in personal, marital, familial, and sexual privacy said to be protected by the Bill of Rights. It is perhaps not generally appreciated that the restrictive criminal abortion laws in effect in a majority of states today are of relatively recent vintage. Those laws, generally proscribing abortion or its attempt at any time during pregnancy, except when necessary to preserve the pregnant woman's life, are not of ancient or even of common law origin. Instead, they derive from statutory changes effected for the most part in the latter half of the 19th century. It is apparent that at common law, at the time of the adoption of our Constitution and throughout the major portion of the 19th century, abortion was viewed with less disfavor than under most American statutes currently in effect. Phrasing it another way, a woman enjoyed a substantially broader right to terminate a pregnancy than she does in most states today. At least with respect to the early stage of pregnancy, and very possible without such a limitation, the opportunity to make this choice was present in this country well into the 19th century. Even later, the law continued for some time to treat less punitively an abortion procured in early pregnancy. The right of privacy, whether it be founded in the 14th Amendment's concept of personal liberty and restrictions upon state action, as we feel it is, or as the District Court determined in the 9th Amendment's reservation of rights to the people, is broad enough to encompass a woman's decision whether or not to terminate her pregnancy. The detriment that the state would impose upon the pregnant woman by denying this choice altogether is apparent. Specific and direct harm, medically diagnosable even in early pregnancy, may be involved. Maternity or additional offspring may force upon the woman a distressful life and future. Psychological harm may be imminent. Mental and physical health may be taxed by childcare. There is also the distress for all concerned associated with the unwanted child, and there is the problem of bringing a child into a family already unable, psychologically and otherwise, to care for it. In other cases, as in this one, the additional difficulties and continuing stigma of unwed motherhood may be involved. All these are factors the woman and her responsible physician necessarily will consider in consultation. We therefore conclude that the right of personal privacy includes the abortion decision, but that this right is not unqualified and must be considered against important state interests in regulation. The District Court held that the appellee failed to meet his burden of demonstrating that the Texas statute's infringement upon Roe's rights was necessary to support a compelling state interest, and that although the appellee presented, quote, several compelling justifications for state presence in the area of abortions, unquote, the statutes outstripped these justifications and swept, quote, far beyond any areas of compelling state interest, unquote. In view of all this, we do not agree that by adopting one theory of life, Texas may override the rights of the pregnant woman that are at stake. We repeat, however, that the state does have an important and legitimate interest in preserving and protecting the health of the pregnant woman, whether she be a resident of the state or a non-resident who seeks medical consultation and treatment there, and that it has still another important and legitimate interest in protecting the potentiality of human life. These interests are separate and distinct. Each grows substantially as the woman approaches term, and at a point during pregnancy, each becomes compelling. With respect to the state's important and legitimate interest in the health of the mother, the compelling point, in the light of present medical knowledge, is at approximately the end of the first trimester. This is so because of the now established medical fact referred to above, that until the end of the first trimester, mortality in abortion may be less than mortality in normal childbirth. It follows that from and after this point, a state may regulate the abortion procedure to the extent that the regulation reasonably relates to the preservation and protection of maternal health. Examples of permissible state regulation in this area are requirements as to the qualifications of the person who is to perform the abortion, as to the licensure of that person, as to the facility in which the procedure is to be performed, that is, whether it must be in a hospital or maybe in a clinic or some other place of less than hospital status, as to the licensing of the facility and the like. This means, on the other hand, that for the period of pregnancy prior to this compelling point, the attending physician in consultation with his patient is free to determine without regulation by the state that in his medical judgment, the patient's pregnancy should be terminated. If that decision is reached, the judgment may be effectuated by an abortion free of interference by the state. With respect to the state's important and legitimate interest in potential life, the compelling point is at viability. This is so because the fetus then presumably has the capability of meaningful life outside the mother's womb. State regulation protective of fetal life after viability thus has both logical and biological justifications. If the state is interested in protecting fetal life after viability, it may go so far as to prescribe abortion during that period, except when it is necessary to preserve the life or health of the mother. Measured against these standards, in restricting legal abortions to those, quote, procured or attempted by medical advice for the purpose of saving the life of the mother, unquote, sweeps too broadly. The statute makes no distinction between abortions performed early in pregnancy and those performed later, and it limits to a single reason, saving the mother's life, the legal justification for the procedure. The statute, therefore, cannot survive the constitutional attack made upon it here. Thank you so much for listening to the No Extra Words podcast. If we've inspired you at all, I hope you'll tell a friend or two about the show, or stop by our website, noextrawords.wordpress.com, to leave some feedback and find out more about our other episodes and upcoming projects.